The sun hung low over the dusty streets of the frontier town, casting long golden shadows across the wooden sidewalks. The wind carried the scent of dry earth, tobacco, and the faint tang of smoke from chimneys struggling to keep pace with the coming night. In the town square, a crowd had gathered, restless and curious, murmuring among themselves as if expecting some grim spectacle. Their eyes were drawn to the center, where a figure struggled against the harsh weight of a leather strap, her back red from lashes that left angry marks on her skin. A widow, alone in the world, had been accused of crimes she did not fully understand, and now her suffering had become the town's grim entertainment. Her eyes, a fierce mix of defiance and fear, scanned the crowd. She was no stranger to hardship. Life had carved its lessons deep into her bones, but this was different. The shame was public, the judgment absolute, and the weight of loneliness pressed down on her harder than any whip ever could. Yet, even in the midst of her torment, there was a quiet fire in her gaze, a stubborn refusal to let despair claim her entirely. Whispers rose like a low wind. Some pitied her, some sneered, and others simply watched. Hungry for a story to take home, the sound of footsteps broke the murmuring, and the crowd parted just enough to reveal a stranger. He moved with a measured, almost predatory grace, the soles of his boots barely disturbing the dust. There was a presence about him, commanding and unusual. A stranger in these parts, yet somehow belonging to the wild that stretched beyond the town's limits. His eyes, dark and steady, scanned the scene, resting finally on the widow who trembled under the gaze of the angry townsfolk. She met his eyes with a mix of hope and disbelief, unsure if what she felt was real or just another trick of her imagination. He was an Apache warrior, tall and broad-shouldered, carrying the strength and dignity of his people like a shield. He bore no weapons at the moment, yet the weight of authority was in every line of his posture. The townspeople froze, unsure how to react to this outsider who dared to step into the center of their judgment. Murmurs swelled into half-formed cries, but no one moved to challenge him. It was as if the wind itself had carried him into the square, and the rules of the town momentarily bent around his presence. The widow felt a shiver of something she had not known in years, protection perhaps, or even the first hint of hope. The Apache warrior's eyes did not waver. He did not speak in anger or demand explanation. His presence alone was a statement. The townspeople sensed it, the unspoken understanding that this man did not belong to their laws or their cruelty. A hush fell, as heavy and sudden as the shadow of night across the desert plains behind the stoic exterior of the warrior. There was something else, something that even he could not fully name. Compassion, recognition, perhaps stirring of connection that neither had expected. In that instant, the widow saw more than a rescuer. She saw a possibility, a life beyond the humiliation, a chance to step from the shadows into a world she had believed closed to her forever. Yet the danger was not over. The town still simmered with resentment, and the law of the square was a fragile thing, easily bent by anger or fear. The man extended a hand, not with arrogance, but with the quiet certainty of someone who knew the value of courage and honor. The widow hesitated, torn between the instinct to flee and the yearning for safety. Around them, the wind carried dust and tension, swirling through the square like restless spirits. Faces pressed forward, eyes narrowed in suspicion, murmurs tinged with both awe and defiance. No one dared move closer, yet none left either. In that tense silence, the widow felt the weight of the world settle on her shoulders. She had lived long enough to know that nothing came freely in these lands, that every act of salvation demanded courage, and every choice carried consequences. The Apache warrior's presence was a challenge, a question asked in the language of the strong and the fearless. Would she trust him, step forward, and seize the possibility of freedom, or remain shackled by fear and the judgment of those who would see her broken? The sun slipped lower, casting an orange glow over the scene. Shadows stretched like fingers across the town square, and the air seemed thick with anticipation. Horses stirred nervously at the edges of the crowd, their hooves kicking up small clouds of dust. and the faint creak of a swinging signboard echoed through the empty spaces between whispers. Every heartbeat in the square seemed magnified, each one a drumbeat to the tension that held the town in a fragile balance. The Apache warrior's gaze remained fixed on her, unwavering yet gentle. It was a promise without words, a shield without metal, a warning that the world outside the town square was vast and unpredictable. The widow knew, deep down, that this moment would change her life forever. The choice was hers, but the weight of that choice pressed heavily on her. Around them, the crowd waited, unsure whether to erupt in anger or to watch silently as the first step toward something new was taken. The widow's mind raced. She thought of the life she had lost, the husband she had mourned, the small cabin that had been her sanctuary, and the endless days of loneliness that had followed. And then she looked at the man before her, a figure who seemed to carry both the wildness of the plains and the strength to protect what mattered. And she wondered if perhaps destiny had a hand in this moment, strange and sudden as it was. She could feel the heat of the day fading, replaced by the cool tension of night, and the weight of every eye in the town square pressing down on her decision. She took a hesitant step forward, and the Apache warrior mirrored her movement, closing the distance with a calm that contrasted sharply with the chaos around them. Every motion was deliberate, every glance a message understood without words. The townspeople murmured, their anger and curiosity mingling into a low hum that seemed almost musical against the backdrop of the wind-swept square. Even the horses seemed to sense the importance of what was unfolding. Their ears pricked, their bodies tense, and then, just as the widow reached out, just as the first touch promised relief and protection, a sudden movement in the crowd drew every eye. A figure emerged from the shadows at the edge of the square, someone who had not yet made their presence known but whose intentions were clear. The air shifted with unease, and the tension that had held steady so far seemed ready to snap. The Apache warrior did not flinch. His gaze sharpened, calculating, assessing. The widow felt a shiver run down her spine, not of fear, but of anticipation, as if the story she had known was about to fracture and bend in ways she could never have imagined. The sun vanished behind the distant hills, leaving the town square bathed in twilight. The widow's hand hovered, caught between trust and hesitation, and the Apache warrior waited, steady and unyielding. Around them, the town held its breath, and the wind whispered of a story just beginning, of paths that would cross and fates that would collide. The square was silent but alive, charged with a tension that promised both danger and liberation. And in that moment, every heart in the crowd seemed to understand the truth. Nothing would ever be the same again. The widow looked at the warrior, the unknown figure in the shadows, and the restless crowd, and realized that her life had reached a turning point. One step forward, one choice, and everything could change. The square held its breath, the wind stilled for just an instant, and the world seemed to pause as destiny leaned in. Waiting for her answer, the widow's hand lingered in the air, suspended between the promise of safety and the pull of uncertainty. Her heart hammered in her chest, loud enough that she feared it might echo across the square. She glanced at the Apache warrior, feeling the quiet steadiness of his presence, and then back toward the figure emerging from the shadows. The stranger's movements were cautious but deliberate, a reminder that even the strongest protector could not shield her from everything the world might throw her way. The tension in the square was not just about her. It was about the fragile balance of law, fear, and the unknown that governed the lives of everyone who lived here. She remembered the day her husband had died. It had been months ago, yet the wound still felt raw, as if time had merely paused around it. He had been a simple man, a farmer with hands calloused from labor and eyes that had always seen the good in people. When sickness took him, the town whispered, but they did not step forward to help. They only watched, and when she spoke, they spoke louder, twisting words to suit their judgment. Life had taught her that the world was cruel and that justice was rarely kind. She had learned to move carefully, to speak less than she felt, and to trust even less than she spoke. But the Apache warrior was different. There was a confidence about him, a strength not born of fear but of understanding. She could sense it, like the calm of a river that ran deep beneath a rushing surface. It was the kind of strength that did not need to dominate, that did not need to humiliate. And yet, it carried danger, because anything unfamiliar in this town was met with suspicion. And suspicion had teeth sharper than any whip. The figure at the edge of the square drew closer, revealing itself to be a man, tall and broad, with a hard expression and eyes like chipped stone. His clothing marked him as someone accustomed to the law, perhaps a sheriff or deputy, though the exact authority he held was unclear. The widow's gaze flickered between him and the Apache warrior, sensing a clash that had been brewing long before either of them had entered the square. The air felt charged, as though every grain of dust carried a spark ready to ignite. The townspeople whispered again, some moving slightly forward, others inching back. They had seen violence before, but this was different. This was not a robbery or a fight over cattle. This was a confrontation of wills, of belief, of territory in a place where law and wilderness collided. And at the center of it all stood the widow. More than just a victim, though she had been once, she was the symbol of something larger. Something raw and unclaimed, waiting for its shape to be determined. The Apache warrior spoke, his voice low but firm, carrying across the open square. He did not shout or demand. He stated simply and clearly that the widow would go with him. The words were not a request. They were a declaration. The stranger at the edge of the square tensed, his jaw tightening, and the townspeople shuffled, uncertain whether to intervene or retreat. The widow felt a shiver run through her, part fear, part anticipation, part relief. She'd never imagined that someone would stand so openly for her. And yet here he was, as solid and immovable as the earth beneath their feet. Her mind raced with questions. Who was this man really? Why had he chosen her, a widow from a small town, to intervene for? The Apache warrior's eyes met hers again, and in them she saw no arrogance, no pity, only resolve. But there was also a mystery, something hidden beneath the surface. Like the quiet strength of the plains that could either nurture or destroy depending on the wind. She wanted to ask, but words failed her, trapped by the weight of the moment and the watchful eyes around them. The man from the shadows took another step forward, his hand hovering near the holster at his hip. The widow's pulse quickened. She had seen men like him before, men who relied on authority, on fear, to maintain control. Yet the Apache warrior did not flinch. He stood taller, his posture unwavering, like a tree rooted deep in the ground, ready to weather any storm. The widow could not help but wonder what past battles had carved that calm into him. What journeys had taught him patience and precision, as the sun finally dipped behind the distant hills. Casting the square in the blue-gray of twilight, the widow felt an almost electric anticipation. Every shadow seemed to deepen, every movement magnified. She sensed the town itself was holding its breath, waiting to see which way this conflict would lean. And yet the deeper fear was not about the stranger or the townspeople, was about what would come after. She knew that if she stepped forward with the Apache warrior, her life would change irreversibly. The town would not forget, and neither would she. She had spent her life on the edge of the frontier, where survival depended on caution and cleverness. She remembered nights spent under a thin blanket of stars, the wind rattling the cabin walls, wondering whether the next day would bring food, work, or more hardship. She had seen neighbors fall to sickness, to misfortune, to cruel chance. And through it all, she had endured, carving out small victories and fragile moments of peace. But this moment was unlike any she had known. It was not just about survival, it was about choice, about stepping into a life that might be bigger, wilder, and far more dangerous than anything she had imagined. The Apache warrior shifted slightly, just enough for her to notice, a signal that he was ready to move, to act. To claim the space between them as a boundary no one could cross. The man at the edge of the square muttered something under his breath, a warning or a threat she could not fully hear. The townspeople stiffened, some inching closer, some recoiling. The widow realized that every eye in the square was on her, yet she felt a strange calm settling into her chest. For the first time in months, perhaps years, she felt as if the wind of fate had changed direction. carrying her away from the shadows and toward something unknown. Yet questions remained, gnawing at the edges of her mind. Who had sent this man into the square at this moment? Was the Apache warrior truly an ally, or was there some other force guiding him, some purpose she could not yet understand? And what of the town? Would they accept what was coming? Or would they rise in anger and claim her suffering as their own again? She felt the weight of history, of the land itself, pressing down, as if the plains and the mountains and the wind were all watching, judging and waiting. The Apache warrior extended his hand again, and this time she took it, feeling the warmth of his grip and the unspoken promise of protection. The crowd held its collective breath. Even the horses seemed to sense the moment, stamping lightly, shifting in the dust. The town square, once a place of judgment and shame, now felt like the threshold to something larger, something untamed and uncertain. As they began to move, the man at the edge of the square stepped forward fully, revealing not just authority, but determination, his eyes locking on the Apache warrior. The widow could see that this would not be a simple walk away. The path she had chosen was lined with obstacles, threats, and questions that demanded answers. And yet as she followed, she felt the first taste of freedom she had known in months, a bitter and thrilling freedom that carried risk in every step. The sun had fully disappeared behind the horizon, leaving the square bathed in twilight, shadows stretching long and thin. The wind picked up, carrying dust and whispers, as if the land itself were telling stories of battles fought, of courage tested, of lives caught between law and wilderness. The widow's thoughts spun with memories and possibilities. Each step with the Apache warrior, a step further into the unknown. Somewhere in the back of her mind, she felt the pull of the town, the eyes that had watched her suffer, the voices that had judged her. But in front of her, a new horizon beckoned, dark and mysterious, yet full of promise. And she realized with a mixture of fear and hope that the story was far from over. The night would not be kind, the path would not be safe, and the choices she had made would echo far beyond the town square. But for the first time in a long while, she felt alive. As they moved toward the edge of the town, the widow stole one last glance over her shoulder. The shadows of the crowd remained a silent witness to the beginning of something that none of them could fully understand. The Apache warrior's hand remained firm around hers, a lifeline and a challenge all at once. The night stretched ahead, dark and uncertain, carrying whispers of danger, courage, and fate. And in the quiet tension between what had been and what was to come, she realized that every step forward was a step into a story still being written, a story where nothing was certain except the choices they were about to make together. The night settled over the town like a heavy blanket, thick with shadows and half-seen shapes. The widow walked beside the Apache warrior, her hand still gripping his, feeling the strange mix of safety and tension that came with every step. Behind them, the town square remained alive with whispers and restless movement, the echo of judgment clinging to the edges of the wooden buildings. Though they were moving away, the weight of what had happened pressed down on her. The fear, the humiliation, the stares, they were not easily shaken off, and she sensed that the town would not simply let the matter drop as they moved toward the outskirts. The Apache warrior's eyes remained sharp, scanning the horizon even in the dim light. The trail beyond town led into rough terrain, where rocks jutted like broken teeth from the earth, and the wind carried unfamiliar scents. He was cautious, not because he doubted his own strength, but because he understood that danger often came in ways that could not be predicted. The widow followed, uncertain of what lay ahead, yet drawn by the quiet authority that seemed to surround him. Every step was measured, deliberate, as if the land itself demanded respect and vigilance. The widow's thoughts drifted back to the town, to the murmurs and judgmental stares, and to the man at the edge of the square who had challenged them. She wondered what he would do now, and whether the story she had just lived would follow her like a shadow. She had seen fear twist people before, turning them into something unrecognizable. Would the townspeople rise in anger or simply whisper, behind closed doors, plotting the next attempt to control her fate? And what about the man himself? Would he seek vengeance? Or would he recognize that this was more than a simple challenge of law? The Apache warrior seemed to sense her thoughts. He tightened his grip slightly, not in warning, but as reassurance. "The town has its own rules," he said quietly, his voice low, carrying across the darkness without raising alarm. "They follow what they know, not what is right. That is why we must be careful." She nodded, absorbing the weight of his words. It was a lesson she had not fully understood before, that survival required more than courage, it required patience, calculation, and the wisdom to read danger before it struck. The trail led them to a small clearing where the land opened up under the dim glow of the moon. Here, the wind seemed to speak more clearly, rustling through scrub and low trees. The Apache warrior paused, surveying the area. The widow noticed the faint markings etched into stones and logs, symbols that she did not recognize. He knelt briefly, tracing the lines with his fingers, as though speaking silently to the land. She realized then that he was not only a protector, but also someone deeply connected to the earth, to the stories it carried, and to the paths that had been walked long before settlers arrived. The widow shivered, partly from the cool night air, and partly from the realization that her life was becoming entwined with forces far beyond her previous understanding. The warrior's presence was grounding, yet the mysteries surrounding him were vast. She had seen hints of them before: his calm in the face of danger, his knowledge of the land, the way he seemed to read people and situations with uncanny clarity, but each hint only deepened the questions. Who was he, truly? What had brought him to intervene at that precise moment in the town square, and why her? Meanwhile, back in town, the man who had challenged them paced in the shadows near the tavern. His jaw was tight, his eyes dark with unease and anger. He had expected the widow to be alone, frightened, vulnerable. Instead, she had been claimed by someone who did not answer to his authority, someone who carried a presence that unsettled the town itself. He felt a mixture of fear and frustration, the kind that came from realizing that control was slipping through his fingers. Around him, other men gathered quietly, curious and hesitant, sensing the rising tension but unsure where to place themselves. It was clear that the town's hierarchy was fragile, that the Apache warrior had disrupted it in a way that could not easily be undone. The widow sensed that danger would follow them, though she did not yet know its form. She thought of her husband, of the life she had lost, and of the long months spent alone, trying to find some measure of dignity in a world that had shown her little kindness. Now, she realized, she was stepping into a life that could be just as harsh, yet also carried the promise of something she had almost forgotten: hope. But hope, she knew, came with a price. The path ahead would not be simple or safe. The town's anger was not easily quelled, and the shadow of judgment lingered over her like a storm cloud. The Apache warrior broke the silence, his voice steady but careful. There are those who will follow, those who wish to punish or to reclaim what they believe is theirs. You cannot ignore them. He did not need to elaborate. She understood perfectly. Danger was coming, not just from the town, but from the tangled web of law, pride, and fear that governed its people. Every choice she had made, every step she had taken, had consequences that were already reaching toward them, invisible but inevitable. The widow took a deep breath and tried to steady her thoughts. She thought of her father, a man who had lived off the land and taught her the quiet lessons of patience and observation. He had spoken often of the balance between courage and caution, of knowing when to fight and when to retreat. She had remembered those words in the town square, when her instincts had wavered between fear and trust. And now, walking beside the Apache warrior, she realized that those lessons were more relevant than ever. Each moment required attention, each movement demanded careful thought. The world beyond the town square was bigger and wilder, and it would not forgive mistakes lightly as they moved deeper into the rough terrain. The widow noticed signs of other travelers. Footprints, discarded scraps, and faint traces of campfires hinted that they were not alone in the wilderness. She wondered who else might be tracking them and what motives drove those who lurked unseen. Every rustle in the brush, every shadow cast by the moonlight made her pulse quicken. It was a reminder that the world outside the town's dusty streets was vast, untamed, and full of unknown dangers. The Apache warrior remained vigilant, scanning the horizon and listening to the subtle sounds of the night. At times, he would pause, crouch, and study the ground with a careful eye. The widow watched him, realizing that he was teaching her, even without words. He was showing her how to read the land, how to anticipate danger, and how to move with purpose rather than fear. Each lesson was small, yet vital, and she absorbed them, aware that her survival depended as much on learning as on courage. Back in the town, whispers continued to grow. Some spoke of the widow with sympathy, others with resentment, and a few with fear. The man who had challenged the Apache warrior moved among them, trying to gather allies, trying to restore the sense of order that had been shattered in the square. But the more he tried, the more he realized that control was slipping. The widow's fate had become a story that would not be contained, a story that could alter the balance of power and respect in the town. As the night deepened, the widow felt the weight of uncertainty pressing down on her. Each step forward was a step into a world she did not yet understand. Alongside a man whose strength and purpose were clear, yet whose past remained a mystery. Danger was near. She could feel it in the air, in the shifting shadows, in the way the wind carried unfamiliar scents. And still, there was a pull she could not resist. A sense that the path she had chosen, perilous as it might be, was the only one that could lead her towards something resembling freedom. The Apache warrior finally stopped near a rocky ridge, looking back at her with eyes that reflected both concern and trust. "We must rest here," he said. "The night is long, and those who follow us will test our patience. We cannot move blindly." She nodded, kneeling beside a large boulder, trying to steady her racing thoughts. Every noise seemed amplified. Every shadow seemed alive, and yet the warrior's calm presence offered a fragile sense of security. They were quiet for a moment, listening to the wind, the rustle of leaves, and the distant call of a night bird. The widow thought of the town square, of the fear and judgment she had endured, and of the strange turn of events that had brought her to this place. She wondered what would come next, what obstacles awaited them, and whether the townspeople's anger would reach them even here, and though she felt the tension of uncertainty, she also felt the faint stirrings of resolve, would face whatever came, not as a broken widow, but as someone who had survived, and who had taken a step into a life she could not yet fully see. The wind shifted again, carrying with it a new scent, something faint and unfamiliar. The widow's heart quickened. The night was far from over, and the first trials of this journey were only beginning. She knew that the Apache warrior's protection was not absolute, that danger could strike at any moment, and that their journey would test them both in ways they could not yet imagine. And in the stillness between movements and the quiet tension of the night, she understood that the story was far from its end. It was only beginning, and the true challenges were yet to come. The moon rose high over the rugged landscape, casting pale silver light across the uneven terrain. Every shadow seemed to stretch unnaturally, twisting among the rocks and scrub as if the night itself were alive and watching. The widow and the Apache warrior moved. Cautiously, their footsteps muffled against the soft earth, yet every rustle, every distant snap of a twig, made her pulse quicken. She had never felt the wilderness so alive, so deliberate, as if every gust of wind carried a warning. Danger was near. She could feel it in the tightening of her chest, the sweat on her palms, the unshakable sense that unseen eyes were tracking their movements. The Apache warrior moved with a fluid grace, scanning the horizon with eyes sharp and steady. He had become her guide, her shield, and her anchor in a world that had so often turned cruel. Yet even he did not speak much, sensing that words could draw attention, or worse, reveal weaknesses to those who might be following. The widow felt the weight of his silence, the careful tension in his posture, and she understood that this was more than a journey through the wilderness. It was a test of patience, courage, and resolve. Every step carried the weight of the town's anger, the unpredictability of the land, and the shadow of forces she could not yet name. As they approached a narrow canyon, the wind carried faint sounds, voices, perhaps, or the echo of hoofbeats. The widow froze, gripping the warrior's arm, and he signaled her to crouch behind a large boulder. From their hiding place, they could see movement in the distance, figures cloaked in shadow. Advancing with deliberate caution, The widow's breath caught in her throat. The town had not forgotten her, and these strangers might be its emissaries, men sent to reclaim control, to punish what they did not understand. The Apache warrior's expression remained unreadable, but the tension in his jaw betrayed the slightest hint of concern. "They are skilled," he murmured, almost to himself. "They know the land, and they do not hesitate." His hand brushed hers briefly, a silent reassurance, and the widow felt a shiver run down her spine. It was not fear alone. It was the thrill of survival, the edge of danger sharpened by the night. She had lived in fear before, but never with such clarity. Never with the sense that each moment was a choice that could change everything. The figures advanced closer, their movements precise, almost predatory. The widow recognized the shape of men who were trained, whose eyes had seen battles, and whose hands had handled weapons more often than they had touched kindness. The wind shifted again, carrying the smell of smoke and dust, and she realized that their pursuers were not far behind. Every instinct told her to run blindly, yet the Apache warrior remained calm, every muscle coiled and ready. His eyes met hers, and she knew that she had to trust him completely. Though the questions in her mind were urgent and unrelenting, who were these men? Were they part of the town's law, or something darker? And what would happen if they were caught? The canyon narrowed, forcing them into a tight path flanked by jagged rock walls. The shadows grew longer, twisting with the wind, and every sound seemed amplified: the scrape of stone, the distant call of a night bird, the whisper of leaves. The widow felt her heart hammering in her chest, a mix of fear and anticipation that left her dizzy. She thought of the town square, of the lashes she had endured, and of the Apache warrior's steady hand guiding her into this unknown. The contrast was stark, a life of humiliation replaced by a life of danger, yet filled with the possibility of freedom. Suddenly, a shout broke the night, sharp and demanding. The figures ahead had noticed something, and the chase, or confrontation, was imminent. The Apache warrior's body tensed like a spring. "Move," he whispered, and they pressed forward, slipping along the edge of the canyon like shadows themselves. Every rock underfoot threatened to betray them. Every breath carried risk. Yet they moved with a precision born of experience and instinct. The widow followed, her fear tempered by the strange exhilaration of being alive in a way she had not felt for years. The pursuit grew louder, the voices closer. The widow could see glimpses of men moving between rocks, their faces hard, their eyes sharp. They were skilled trackers, no doubt, trained to follow and capture. She felt a surge of panic, but the Apache warrior's calm presence anchored her. He led them into a small hollow, hidden from sight by a cluster of scrub and low rocks. They crouched together, hearts pounding, listening as the men searched the canyon floor, their voices full of anger and suspicion. The widow's mind raced. She thought of her husband, of the quiet life she had lost, and of the harsh reality of the world that had shaped her. Yet here, beside the warrior, she felt the pulse of something larger, something beyond fear and cruelty. She realized that survival would require more than hiding. It would demand courage, cunning, and trust in someone she barely knew, but whose presence had become her lifeline. She could not turn back now, could not retreat to the past. The canyon, the night, and the hunter's shadow pressed forward, and every choice she made would carry weight. The Apache warrior crouched low, his eyes scanning every angle. He spoke softly, his voice deliberate. "They will try to cut us off at the ridge. We must be ready." She nodded, her grip tightening on the makeshift walking stick she had picked up along the way. The night was alive with tension, every sound and movement magnified, and the hollow seemed to shrink around them as the pursuers drew near. She could hear their hushed commands, the scrape of boots against stone, the occasional muttered curse. The widow realized that the town's anger had found her here, in the wilderness, and that there would be no easy escape. Time seemed to stretch. Each breath was loud, each shadow a potential threat. The widow's mind flickered with memories of hardship and loss, yet also with the strange, thrilling possibility of survival. She had faced cruelty before, but never with the chance of a life she could claim for herself. and yet danger was unavoidable. The canyon would force a confrontation, whether they wished it or not. The Apache warrior shifted slightly, preparing for what was to come, and she felt the tension coil tighter around her. Suddenly, a figure appeared at the edge of the ridge, silhouetted by moonlight. The widow's breath caught. It was not just one pursuer, but several, and their movements were calculated, as if they had anticipated the warrior's tactics. Her heart pounded in her chest, and she realized that the night held no guarantees. Each step forward brought them closer to confrontation, closer to the point where hiding would no longer suffice. She felt a flicker of fear that was almost overwhelming, yet it was paired with a sharp edge of determination. She had come this far, and turning back was not an option. The Apache warrior's eyes narrowed, tracking the movements above. "They are setting a trap," he said quietly. "We cannot let them corner us. We must force the choice." His voice carried a calm authority that belied the tension in the canyon. The widow could feel his hand brush against hers, a subtle gesture of reassurance, and she knew that the next moments would decide everything. Not life or death alone, but freedom, control, and the fragile thread of hope that had brought her here. The figures on the ridge shifted again, their shadows dancing across the canyon walls. The widow could sense the imminence of conflict, the fine line between survival and capture. She felt the wind shift, carrying the scent of dust and leather, the unmistakable tang of danger. Her pulse raced, her senses sharpened. The Apache warrior crouched beside her, every muscle ready, eyes locked on the ridge. She realized then that there would be no turning back, no retreat, and no guarantee of safety. The story had reached its point of tension. The precipice, where every choice mattered, and the canyon seemed to hold its breath along with them. Then, from above, a branch snapped a signal or an accident. She could not tell. The pursuers had noticed them. The widow's stomach twisted, fear and anticipation coiling together. She gripped the warrior's arm, ready to follow his lead into whatever came next. The Apache warrior's gaze hardened, his body shifting, preparing for confrontation. The canyon seemed to close in around them, shadows stretching long and thin. The night was alive, tense and unrelenting. The figures began to descend, moving with deliberate caution, their voices low but filled with purpose. The widow felt her heartbeat echo in her ears, a drum of tension that matched the rhythm of the approaching danger. Every instinct screamed at her to run, to hide, yet she stayed, anchored by the presence of the warrior at her side. The canyon would soon erupt into action, and the choice of how to meet it rested on them alone. The Apache warrior crouched lower, his eyes scanning the terrain, calculating angles, anticipating every movement. The widow felt a surge of adrenaline and fear, her body tense and ready, senses stretched to the breaking point. The canyon seemed to hum with energy, the wind carrying the whisper of the pursuers, and the night itself seemed to pulse in rhythm with her heart. Every shadow was a threat, every sound a warning. The moment of confrontation was near, the edge of the story where all tension would erupt. Yet its resolution remained unknown. The widow swallowed hard, gripping the warrior's hand, and felt the strange blend of fear, exhilaration, and anticipation. They were close now, close enough that the canyon would decide how the confrontation unfolded. Every instinct, every lesson she had learned, every ounce of courage she possessed would be tested. And as the shadows drew nearer, as the night held them in suspense, she understood that this was the moment that would define everything that came after. The figures above shifted again, as preparing to strike. The Apache warrior's eyes met hers briefly, conveying a message without words. Be ready, trust, survive. The wind carried the sound of movement, of intent, of danger closing in. The canyon seemed to lean in around them, echoing the tension in their hearts. The widow realized that nothing would be simple, that the night would demand everything from them, and that the story was about to reach its most perilous point. The cliff of confrontation loomed ahead, and the edge of suspense stretched taut, waiting for the moment when action would shatter the silence of the night. The tension in the canyon seemed to snap like a taut rope. The figures above hesitated, caught between advancing and retreating, their eyes searching the shadows where the widow and the Apache warrior crouched. Time stretched, each heartbeat magnified in the still night. The widow's palms were slick with sweat, her mind racing with fear and calculation. Yet beneath it all, she felt the strange clarity that comes only when survival hangs in the balance. Every choice mattered, and she would no longer allow herself to be a passive observer of her own life. The Apache warrior shifted slightly, placing himself in a subtle angle that blocked the narrow path, his presence alone a warning to any who dared to cross. His eyes were sharp, unwavering, reading each movement, each hesitation. The widow mirrored him, drawing strength from his calm, his knowledge of the land, and the certainty that he would not let her face danger alone. The wind swept through the canyon, carrying dust and the faint sound of distant voices. And she realized that the confrontation she had feared for days would unfold not with chaos, but with precision. The pursuers advanced cautiously, feet sliding over loose rock, eyes scanning for the slightest hint of movement. One of them stepped too close to the edge of a boulder, and the Apache warrior seized the opportunity, moving with speed and purpose. He shifted, blocking the path and forcing the men to pause, the echo of his presence alone carrying authority. The widow watched, her breath caught in her throat. As the tension between the two sides stretched taut, like the string of a bow ready to release its arrow, a sudden shout rang out, breaking the fragile silence. The men lunged forward, but the warrior's response was swift, precise, and controlled. He guided the widow to a safer position behind a large rock, keeping her protected while using his strength and knowledge of the terrain to create barriers between them and the threat. Dust swirled around them, kicked up by shifting feet in the wind. And the widow felt her heart pounding not just from fear, but from the exhilaration of seeing a plan unfold, the kind of raw courage she had only glimpsed in stories. The men hesitated, confusion flickering in their eyes. They had expected fear, retreat, or chaos, but what they faced was calm determination. The Apache warrior's presence dominated the canyon, not through force alone, but through command of strategy, understanding of the land, and an unspoken assertion that some things, some people, were not theirs to control. The widow realized then that freedom was not merely a place or a safety, was a state of being, claimed by courage and presence of mind. One of the pursuers, frustrated and desperate, made a sudden move. Stepping around the rock to try and flank them, the warrior anticipated it, shifting with a grace that seemed almost instinctive. He intercepted the man, blocking him with minimal effort, a quiet but undeniable statement of authority. The others faltered, exchanging glances that carried more question than command. The widow felt a rush of awe. She had witnessed strength before, but never so deliberate, so measured, so protective without cruelty. The men finally backed away, reassessing the situation. The canyon had become a line in the sand, a test of resolve that they were unwilling to cross. The widow exhaled slowly, her body relaxing for the first time in hours. She realized that the Apache warrior had not just defended her physically, he had defended her autonomy, and her right to exist outside the judgment of those who would have bound her. The lesson was clear. Courage could not only protect, but also redefine the rules that others tried to impose. As the night settled into a quieter rhythm, the warrior led her further along a hidden path, winding between rocks and low trees, until the sounds of pursuit faded into the distance. The widow's legs were weary, but her spirit felt alive, sharper than it had been in years. She looked at the man beside her, realizing that the danger they had faced together had forged a bond beyond words. A connection rooted in trust, respect, and shared endurance. The Apache warrior's eyes softened as he glanced her way. A silent acknowledgement that they had survived together, and that survival had changed them both. They reached a small plateau overlooking a valley below, where the moonlight bathed the land in a gentle glow. The widow sank to her knees, breathing in the crisp night air, letting the tension drain from her body. The Apache warrior stood nearby, scanning the horizon one last time before finally allowing himself to relax. The valley spread out before them, quiet and untouched, a promise of space, freedom, and the unknown. The widow felt something stir inside her, a mixture of relief, awe, and hope. She had left the town, the judgment, and the cruelty behind. And though the path ahead was uncertain, she had chosen it. She thought of the town square, of the lashes, of the whispers and stares, and she realized that they no longer held power over her. Their authority had been challenged, and in a small but significant way, it had faltered. She was no longer a passive subject to fear or shame. She was someone who had acted, who had survived, and who had stepped into a life that demanded courage and demanded choice. The Apache warrior's presence had been the catalyst, but the strength had come from her own willingness to step forward, to trust, and to endure. The warrior finally crouched beside her, offering water from a small flask. She accepted it with gratitude, feeling the cool liquid soothe both her body and her mind. They sat together in silence, letting the night stretch around them, the sounds of the wilderness a balm to frayed nerves. The widow realized that safety, at least for now, had a shape, the quiet companionship of someone who would protect, guide, and trust her in return. She could feel the weight of the past lifting slightly, replaced by a fragile but tangible sense of possibility. Her thoughts drifted to the future. The town would continue to murmur, to judge, to plot, but she was no longer bound by its rules. She could forge a path of her own, one shaped by courage, awareness, and the unexpected alliances she had found. She looked at the Apache warrior, seeing not just a protector, but a guide, a partner, and a reminder that life beyond fear was possible. The valley before them seemed vast and inviting, a place where survival could coexist with freedom, where courage could carve out new beginnings from the harshness of the land. The night deepened, and a quiet wind swept through the plateau, rustling the leaves and carrying the scent of distant pine and earth. The widow felt a sense of finality, not of endings, but of transition. The confrontation in the canyon had been a turning point, a moment that separated what had been from what could be. She realized that life would continue to test her, that dangers and challenges were never fully absent, but the strength to face them had been awakened. She had survived, and in that survival, she had reclaimed a piece of herself that had been lost in grief, fear, and judgment. The Apache warrior finally spoke, his voice soft but steady. "The night is ours for now," he said, glancing toward the valley below. "But the world beyond waits. Choices must still be made. Paths must be followed. We have gained time, not eternity." The widow nodded, understanding that freedom was not absolute. It was a journey, a constant exercise in courage, trust, and awareness. She felt the depth of his words, and the quiet weight of responsibility settled on her shoulders, tempered by the hope and possibility that had been restored as the first hints of dawn touched the horizon. Painting the sky with pale orange and pink, the widow felt a sense of peace she had not known in years. The canyon behind them held memories of fear and confrontation, but it had also borne witness to her strength and resilience. The valley below promised space to rebuild, to heal, and to live on her own terms. She understood now that life was not about avoiding danger, but about meeting it with courage and choice, and about finding those who would walk with her through the unknown, the town. The judgments, the fears, these were chapters she had closed. Though their echoes might linger, the Apache warrior remained at her side, a silent assurance that she was no longer alone, that she had found someone whose strength complemented her own, and whose guidance helped transform fear into possibility. Together, they would navigate the challenges that lay ahead, aware that danger and uncertainty were inevitable, but also aware that courage, trust, and presence of mind could shape outcomes in ways the world had not yet imagined. The widow rose slowly, her legs stiff but steady, and looked out across the valley. The sun's first rays glinted off the rocks, warming the earth and scattering shadows. She realized that life had offered her a second chance, not as a gift, but as the consequence of endurance, courage, and the willingness to act when the moment demanded it. She had been whipped, judged, and humiliated, but she had also been defended, guided, and shown that strength could be found in unexpected places. The story of the town square, the canyon, and the chase had become part of her own narrative, a reminder that even in the darkest moments, the chance for freedom, respect, and dignity remained. Turning to the Apache warrior, she felt a deep gratitude that went beyond words. "Thank you," she said simply, her voice carrying both relief and recognition. He nodded, his expression calm, yet there was a glimmer of something unspoken, unspect, acknowledgement and understanding that the journey had changed them both. They stood together on the plateau, the valley stretching before them, the sun rising to light a new day, and for the first time in what felt like forever, the widow felt the quiet power of choice, courage, and the possibility of life reclaimed. The wind carried their shadows across the land, stretching long and merging with the light. The town would continue its murmurs, the past would leave its marks, and danger would always linger in some form. Yet in that moment, the widow understood that she had stepped beyond the confines of fear and judgment. She had survived, endured, and chosen a path toward freedom. The Apache warrior's hand remained firm at her side, a reminder that courage could be shared, and that the bonds formed in trials could become lifelines in the uncertain journey ahead. And so, with the canyon behind them, the valley ahead, and the first light of morning casting clarity over the world, the widow and the Apache warrior moved forward, together yet aware that every step would require vigilance, courage, and trust. Their story had reached resolution in one sense, yet it also opened a new chapter, a life forged from trials, strengthened by survival, and illuminated by the quiet certainty that freedom, respect, and hope could still be claimed even in a world built on hardship and judgment. Top of form, bottom of form.